Hello, my friend. Welcome back to the club. How are you today? I'm going to start this episode by saying this. I stand corrected, y'all. When it comes to cold therapy, cold plunging, or cold exposure, I've generally taught that while it can be a powerful metabolic and detox tool, it might not be the best choice for someone in a season of high stress or poor nervous system regulation, because adding a stressor, even a good stressor, on top of an already stressed out body can sometimes push things into overload. And we think of the cold as jarring, right? And that jarring the body feels like it would be stressful. But after hearing today's guest share both of his experience and his research, I realized there's a lot more nuance here than I really understood before. So today we're diving into why cold therapy can actually support cortisol in a healthy way, how it impacts other hormones and systems in the body, like testosterone, the thyroid, the metabolism itself. We're going to talk about something I find especially exciting, and that is how cold exposure can support vitamin D and how to use cold strategically for exercise performance and recovery. Also, some nuance here that I think people are unaware of. There is so much to cover, and I'm truly excited to have Professor Thomas Seager here with us today to help set the record straight. Welcome, Dr. Seeger, to the Christian Health Club podcast.
Thank you for having me here, Chelsea. This is a pleasure.
I always enjoy listening to you on other podcasts. I always think this in my head, like if everything else goes to hell in a handbasket, you have a great radio voice. You could do
Thanks.
You could do radio. But anyway, I do so enjoy listening to you, your stories, your information. I think it's really interesting that your background is in engineering and not specifically health, but that you ended up in this space because of your own experience. So tell us how you got here and how you got to be such an expert on cold therapy.
I've become convinced that medical school education is a disadvantage when it comes to health and wellness. I just finished reading Robert Lufkin's Lies I Taught in Medical School. Lufkin is an MD, and I think he's maybe a couple of years older than me. Part of his childhood story is that his mother, if I'm remembering this correctly, was a certified dietitian. My mother read a book called Diet for a Small Planet. And I think this came out, when I was 6 years old or 7 years old or something in the early 70s. And people then with an environmental sensibility like my mother had were looking for ways to feed on a budget. The early 70s were a high inflation, and my father was a university professor on the income that didn't go up with inflation, and adopt a diet that they felt would be more respectful of the environment. And so we wound up, eating a bunch of beans or something. This was terrible nutritional advice. But my parents met at Harvard University. They were both in grad school. They were deeply ensconced in what turned out to be the propaganda and the paid for non-scientific studies that convinced my mother margarine was somehow healthier than butter. We were woke before woke, and she fed us, me and my sisters, in accordance with this sort of ideology of environmental responsibility and mythologies about technology and food that took us away from what was really healthy. So when I read Lies I Taught in Medical School, Lufkin's story related well. Lufkin thought he was doing everything right. He believed the same things that my mother did, that somehow margarine would be safer or healthier than butter, that we should go low fat, that more carbs would be a way of eating lower on the trophic food chain and better for the environment. And Lufkin couldn't understand why he kept getting sicker and sicker. It was only after he started looking at the data in the library, not the textbooks that were written by the pharmaceutical companies that were given away so that he could indoctrinate his medical students into this mythology. When he started looking at the real data in the library, he discovered that everything that emerged in the 1970s about human nutrition was backwards. I had a similar experience. I've written a book called Uncommon Cold, The Science and Experience of Deliberate Cold Exposure or Cold Plunge Therapy, and another one called Uncommon Testosterone. And in these books, I talk about my own evolution. It was really precipitated by my son's diagnosis with diabetes when he was 6 years old. I had just finished my doctoral studies, and I didn't know a dang thing about metabolism or diabetes or nutrition. I had to learn all of that, and so that I could take care of my son. This was before continuous glucose monitors. This was before insulin pumps. And so we're injecting him with insulin in the back of his little arm. And I kept scrupulous records, everything he ate, all of his exercise, every insulin injection. And what I was learning from the American Diabetes Association and his dietitians and from his endocrinologist, it wasn't adding up. It didn't square with the data that I had in his journals. And I began to think, maybe these people just don't know what they're doing. When I was faced with the choice of what does his dietitian or his endocrinologist or his care provider tell me I'm supposed to do, and what is actually working for my son, I would always go with what works for my son. And the heck with whatever the American Diabetes Association says. I remember when he was first diagnosed, we were told he can eat whatever he wants as long as he injects enough insulin for it. But Chelsea, there is no amount of insulin that is going to prevent a blood sugar spike in a 6-year-old eating an Oreo cookie. This is what our experience was. And then, of course, I looked at my other kids and I said, I have data on what this is doing to my diabetic son. But what is it doing to them? What is it doing to me? Everything began to change about my understanding nutrition. This was stripping away the lies that I had been taught as a child. We got into the Atkins diet. Now, at the time, I didn't know anything about seed oil, so I was still so naive. But I was learning about insulin, and I was learning about blood glucose, and I was learning about metabolism. Unfortunately, I didn't prioritize my own health. I ballooned up to about 250 pounds, even as I was monitoring my children's health so closely. And finally, the kids are grown up. Our youngest had just finished high school. And for other reasons that were unrelated to diabetes and the stress that places on a marriage, my wife and I split up. I'd lost a lot of weight because I realized I had to get serious about my own health and not just my kids. I finally got my labs back because, you know, they say 50-something-year-old men should get their labs tested. And one of those tests is called the prostate-specific antigen. This is the PSA, and it is a measure of whether a man has an inflamed prostate. Prostate inflammation is associated with increased risk of prostate cancer. And so everybody says you get this test. And I did it, and the results came back too high, 7. 7 indicated an elevated risk of prostate cancer. And at that point, the catastrophic mind just takes over. I thought I was going to die of prostate cancer because you can't spend more than 20 minutes on WebMD or Cleveland Clinic or something like that without thinking that you have some kind of mysterious defect in your body that is going to kill you. And that's where I was. But I'll be damned if I was going to take their advice and go to the urologist. By that time, I was already so skeptical about what is sometimes called allopathic medicine or centralized medicine. The prescription that they would have for me is, you know, have an exam and that shows inflammation. And then you have a biopsy to look for cancer. But the rate of false positives in those biopsies is so high that it's unlikely to be conclusive, at least on the negative side. And so somebody somewhere is going to say, just as a precaution, you should have a prostatectomy, which is going to leave you with a lifetime of erectile impotence. I wasn't ready for that. I was thinking in my head that if my choices were a life single without ever really being able to have another erection, no woman was ever going to love me, or I could die a long, slow, miserable death from prostate cancer. And I was prepared for the long, slow, miserable death if that's what it took. However, I decided I was going to see if I could treat this on my own. Instead of resigning myself to this horrible fate that existed in my catastrophic imagination, I decided to get really serious about ice baths. Ice baths are good for inflammation. Ice baths are good for metabolism. So I went in and out of a ketogenic diet, and I started doing ice baths every day. It took me 4 months to have the courage to go back to the lab and have that blood drawn again. And if the PSA had come back even higher, I don't know what I would have done. This is what I mean by the courage. I was living like not wanting to know for those 4 months.
Yeah.
test came back 1.8. No elevated risk of prostate cancer, no inflammation, no problem. I tested again about a month later, 1.1. So I was still going in the right direction. And that's when I finally went to the urologist. I said, all right, I'm in the clear. I'm going to take these test reports into the doctor. I'm going to get a big, medal pinned on my chest for figuring this out, right? The doctor didn't care. The doctor didn't care about my PSA. The doctor looked at the Men's Health panel. If you check all those boxes when you get your labs, it includes total testosterone. And one of the things that kind of happened accidentally when I was doing ice baths every day is that my total testosterone went from about 750 nanograms per deciliter to 1180. 1180 is so high that it gets marked with like a red exclamation mark. And it says, look, there's no way this 53-year-old, fat college professor has total testosterone that is this high. And my urologist looked at that and he said, this guy must be juicing. He must be taking like black market steroids. Now, for a long time, medical doctors have believed incorrectly that testosterone will promote prostate cancer because testosterone is anabolic. It promotes cell growth. And they're like, well, that's the last thing you want. If you have prostate cancer, the cancer is a growing cell. And so medical doctors have been putting men, including one of my friends, on testosterone suppression to treat the risk of prostate cancer. The data says exactly the opposite. Testosterone protects against prostate cancer. And there's a lot of data on this. Dr. Abraham Morgentaler has been really good at documenting what really happens in a man in his relationship between total testosterone and prostate cancer. But that doesn't mean that practices in medicine have caught up with the data. So my urologist, he wanted one more test. He wanted luteinizing hormone. If my luteinizing hormone were low and my total testosterone was high, he would have told me, get yourself off the steroids. You're going to give yourself prostate cancer if you don't have it all ready. So I went back to the lab. I had blood drawn again. My luteinizing hormone came back 8.9, which has a red exclamation mark, off the charts, too high. That told my urologist that everything about my testosterone levels was natural, and I never heard from the guy again. Now, this is the story that convinced me the medical establishment is the wrong way to think about health and well-being. If you're in a car crash and you've broken a bone, thank goodness we have orthopedic surgeons, who can help to put you back together. But when it comes to chronic illness, the track record of medicine in the United States is abysmal. Jay Bhattacharya, when he was in his confirmation hearing at the Senate, he pointed it out, and it's true. Life expectancy in the United States peaked in 2014, and we have been going down since. It particularly fell off a cliff in about 2021, and it's recovered a little bit. But chronic illness is the problem, not infectious disease. And it is all those chronic illnesses that originate in a single cause, which we could address if we wanted to. We would just have to throw out all the medical misconceptions and what Marty Macri called in his book, Blind Spots, the dogma, those falsehoods, those popular misconceptions that cannot be questioned by the medical schools or the medical researchers, probably for reasons of economics, because they would erode the profit potential of massive pharmaceutical companies, despite the fact that they are wrong. Every single leading cause of death in the United States from chronic illness originates in insulin resistance. And something like 80% of the adult American population is insulin resistant or metabolically dysfunctional to some extent. Ben Bickman from BYU is really good on this. He wrote a book called Why We Get Sick, and he traces cancer. He traces heart disease. He traces Alzheimer's back to the dysfunction that we experience in our metabolism when our mitochondria aren't right. This is now the scientific, the mechanistic basis for cold plunge therapy, how it will recruit new brown fat into your body, how that brown fat is packed with mitochondria, how will it improve your insulin sensitivity, give you more energy, keep your brain sharp and extend the number of real quality years that you have in your life, if not your lifespan as a whole. This is why I do these podcasts now, and I sort of push back against the mythology on social media of people who say, well, ice baths are stressful. Ice baths couldn't possibly be good for you, blah, blah, blah. Ice baths are what is keeping us sane and alive in this crazy industrialized world in which we would otherwise be disconnected from nature.
Man, what a fantastic intro and story into what we're talking about today. Why don't we start with the mitochondria then? I love that subject. And I think that will naturally evolve us into all the other places that we could talk about, like cortisol and vitamin D and all the other things, fat burning, whether or not it's actually burning fat or how that's working with the brown fat. So let's just kind of start there.
The mitochondria are still way overlooked. There's this mythology of the DNA in the nucleus, Watson and Crick, and they discover the double helix and there are Nobel Prizes. At the time, the country was at the apex of the Industrial Revolution. This is after World War II, when the U.S. industrial enterprise is the envy of the world. And somebody got it in their head that DNA was like the chief executive officer of the human factory. Human beings are not factories. It's the wrong metaphor. It's the wrong way to think of DNA. DNA is not the master controller of the human body. But the way that, the American society celebrated the discovery of the double helix, people thought that there was some authoritarian hierarchical magic to your DNA. The DNA is a library. It is that passive. Your body goes to the library of DNA when it needs to synthesize certain proteins. And it says, hey, DNA, have you got a cookbook for this protein? And it will call upon the DNA and say, here's the recipe. You use these genes, you replicate some RNA, and from the RNA, we construct proteins, and that's going to solve a problem in the body. The DNA doesn't dictate a dang thing. The DNA is this repository of protein recipes. It is the mitochondria that dictate which of those proteins should be manufactured, and there's a good reason for it. The mitochondria are the sensory organelles inside the cell. The mitochondria are the ones that sense your light environment, for example. It is mitochondria that cause you to sleep. It is mitochondria that sense all the metabolites in your bloodstream that your gut microbiome has produced from the food that you eat. It is the mitochondria that knows what's going on in your body. And it is the mitochondria that control the epigenome. The epigenome is a coding over the genes, and it decides which genes are expressed and which are not expressed. And so there's a massive industry ever since the Human Genome Project. You can now get your, personal DNA sequenced with the exception of some rare defects. It's pointless. Do not worry about your personal genome. Worry about the environment, the stimulus in which you place yourself that turns those genes on or off. And it is the mitochondria that are sensing that environment. So there's lots of theories of aging. When I was a doctoral student, I had a toxicology class, and my professor there, he was on the science advisory board at the US EPA, which is like the top of our environmental engineering profession. I remember him saying, old age causes cancer. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was wrong back then. It just doesn't make any sense to me, but I didn't know how to describe why it was wrong. When you do not take care of your mitochondria, they accumulate damage. The DNA that mitochondria have, their own DNA, which is exclusively inherited from your mother, they're not as well protected as the DNA in the nucleus. As your mitochondria age without becoming restored, then your body ages. Aging, and there's lots of different theories, but aging is the process of accumulated mitochondrial damage. And when the mitochondria are incapable of doing the energy conversion job that the cell requires them to do, When they're incapable of signaling cell death, it's time for the cell to expire, for example. When they're incapable of working in this milieu of information trading that happens between all the cells of your body, then cancer can take over. It's not old age that causes cancer or heart disease or Alzheimer's. It is mitochondrial degradation. When you restore the function of the mitochondria, you restore cognitive function, you restore fertility, you restore sexual performance and function. Everything in our human body relies upon the mitochondria in two ways, both for the energy that we need, but also as the information signaling agents that control everything else that's happening in the body. If there was a CEO, it would be the mitochondria, not the DNA. And so there's a need for a tremendous shift of emphasis away from the DNA and towards the mitochondria to look for the origins of chronic illness. And what are the therapies that would target mitochondria so that we can change all of the curves that have been going the wrong way in the United States for more than 10 years now? Increase life expectancy, increase quality of life, decrease the rate of diagnosis of chronic illness, and extend lives that are free of prescription drugs instead of sequestering, like my parents were, people away in nursing homes, maintaining their vitality. The only disadvantage that I can see is that there are no longer royalty streams for the pharmaceutical industry that is selling them statins or blood pressure medication or whatever the pills are that don't work for the chronic illnesses that they have.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, when I talk about the mitochondria, I just try to remind people when you think metabolism, think mitochondria, right? And so let's talk about how cold therapy is affecting the mitochondria and weave in hormones like cortisol, like testosterone, like the reproductive hormones that people think about, and your thyroid and all of these things happening. How is the cold affecting all of those hormones and systems?
Cortisol is a normal, healthy hormone on which your body relies. Cortisol is what wakes you up in the morning. In the morning, both your testosterone and your cortisol levels will be at the highest of any, time during the day. There's nothing wrong with elevated cortisol when it is in response to stress. And that stress could be a workout that you have in the gym, or it could be 3 minutes that you spend in the cold water. The best data on cortisol and cold plunge is coming out of the Lithuanian Sports University. There are a lot of studies on cortisol that show those naive to cold plunge will experience a cortisol spike as a result of the stress of the cold plunge, which is a very normal kind of thing. But at the Lithuanian Sports University, they've gathered more data than anybody else, and they've done longer term studies. And they've shown that if your cortisol is already high when you get into the cold water, it doesn't go any higher. It's almost as if your body understands what a healthy level of cortisol is for you relative to the stress that you're undergoing. And your body's not going to overload itself with cortisol because it already knows. Now, there isn't a lot of data that shows this. Most of the studies on cortisol will take subjects who are naive, they will put them in the cold one time, and they will notice a cortisol spike and then get all excited about how somehow that must be a dangerous thing. But those few studies that have exposed for longer periods, that is, people will come back several times a week and they'll do this for several weeks, show that the human body acclimates to the cold. Even though you still get the same gasp reflex or the same sympathetic nervous system activation, you do not get the same cortisol response. That cortisol response to the cold becomes muted over time because your body has adjusted. And so a lot of the social media alarmism about cortisol is misplaced as if cortisol were bad. No, it's not. Cortisol is supposed to happen episodically in response to stressful episodes. High levels of chronic cortisol, those are bad. When you take a rat and you keep it in a cage under a state of constant torture, it will experience chronically elevated cortisol levels, and that's associated with a number of poor health outcomes. And so there's good research in animal models and chronically elevated cortisol. And that's not what we're talking about at all. Cortisol is a healthy response to a hormetic stress. And it should probably be no surprise that as you practice that stress, you become acclimated to it, and it no longer sort of surprises you in the same way. Your cortisol response becomes muted. So there's a lot of popular misconceptions on social media, and there's a good reason for it. Nobody wants stress. There's this book that Kelly McGonigal, she's a faculty member at Stanford University, she wrote, it's called The Upside of Stress. You know, we all run around talking about, oh, the stress is killing me. Oh, we have too much stress in our lives. We really need to get our stress under control. And to some extent, it's a bunch of nonsense. Get your seed oil intake under control and stop telling yourself a story about how the stress is killing you. Because in Kelly McGonigal's book, she said, the story you tell yourself about the stress is more important to your health outcomes than the actual stress. These were people who they were tracing longevity by watching the obituaries, and they would rate themselves for stress. And then the researchers would ask them about their attitudes towards that stress. And the people who saw their stress very negatively, sure enough, they lived shorter, more miserable lives than the people who'd said, well, it's a difficult time right now, and this is going to make me stronger. You know, these are some of the challenges that I'm working with. And in a way, I'm kind of looking forward to grappling with them. It wasn't the stressful experience. It was the way the subject made meaning of the stressful experience. Now, the irony is in The Upside of Stress, where Kelly McGonigal is like revolutionizing our popular misconception about what it means to experience stress. She also described what's called the cold pressor test. This is a standardized psychological instrument that people use to measure stress response. They take usually the non-dominant hand, dip it in some ice water, and they see, you know, how long can you keep your hand in ice water? It's very painful. We're going to measure your pulse and things like that. Kelly, trying to give her readers an appreciation for how difficult the cold pressor test is, she wrote, if you were to immerse your entire body in ice water of this temperature, you'd be dead within 2 minutes. Now, here I am, Chelsea. I've done this 2,500 times. I'm still alive, even in a book that is intended to reframe how we think about stress and correct popular misconceptions about the dangers of stress. Kelly McGonigal has published this, sort of throwaway paragraph about how an ice bath is going to kill you, when in fact, the ice bath is exactly the same as the experience she's talking about. People don't like the idea of stress. They like the benefits of having survived the stress, of having managed the stress. I've never regretted an ice bath, but man, those 15 seconds where I'm staring at the ice floating in my Morosco, they're the worst, because in my imagination, I'm thinking about how terrible, how awful it's going to be to get into that ice water. And then it takes sort of 30 seconds of structuring my breathing, and I'm in that freezing water saying, what was I even worried about? Like, this is no big deal, and nothing bad can happen to me the rest of the day. But we all experience the aversion to the difficult thing, to our imagination telling us that we should just go back to bed, crawl up underneath the covers, I don't know, maybe have a hot toddy or something, and stay comfortable in our lives. It just doesn't get us anywhere.
It sounds way better. I have to tell you, I have a high aversion to getting in the cold. It is one of those things I know it's good for me, and I just cannot get it done. Dr. Seeger, yep. It's on my radar to do, but this is why, part of the reason I wanted to have you on today. And there's so many benefits to it. Let's talk about, you maybe talk about the mechanisms of how it's supporting like your testosterone, or how it's supporting thyroid, how it's supporting, I've heard you say it's not directly maybe fat burning or weight loss specifically. We don't make that direct correlation or causation, but just kind of explain the mechanism of why it can be beneficial for the entire metabolic system.
Okay, so there's three things in there. There's metabolism, fat burning in particular, thyroid, and testosterone. Let's start with testosterone. All sex hormone synthesis originates in the mitochondria. This is something that your medical doctor probably isn't going to explain to you. But sex hormones are synthesized from cholesterol. And one of the reasons nobody tells you that you need cholesterol in your body to synthesize these hormones is because statins are the single most profitable class of drugs ever. It doesn't mean they work. All the data shows that statins do not have a longevity benefit, and they have serious consequences: Alzheimer's, insulin resistance. But statins make so much money for the pharmaceutical companies that they have been ratcheting down the recommended cholesterol levels to lower and lower levels, convincing medical doctors that people with ordinary healthy levels of cholesterol should be put on a statin to treat a lab report rather than a health outcome. And what that means is sometimes it messes with your testosterone levels, because inside the mitochondria, there is an enzyme called P450-SCC. It is what cleaves a hydrocarbon connection in the cholesterol and converts it into a sex steroid called pregnenolone. All the other sex steroids are downstream of pregnenolone. If your mitochondria are not numerous enough, or the membranes don't work properly so that they can transport the cholesterol to the inner mitochondrial membrane, do the conversion, and then put it back out into your bloodstream. If your mitochondria are dysfunctional, then your sex steroid synthesis is dysfunctional. And so why are testosterone levels in men and women so low? Because the rate of mitochondrial impairment is so high. To fix your sex steroids, you've got to fix your mitochondria. And one of the best things you can do to stimulate mitobiogenesis, so this is the creation of new mitochondria in your body, is cold water immersion therapy. Here, it stimulates your body to recruit new brown fat. It is brown fat that are packed with mitochondria. They perform what's called non-shivering thermogenesis to defend your core body temperature. And this is another one of those misconceptions. It used to be that medical doctors thought there's no such thing as brown fat in adult human beings. 15 or so years ago, positron emission tomography identified brown fat in only about 5% of the subjects, but in human subjects who regularly experienced cold. You can maintain your brown fat if you have regular exposure to cold. And that brown fat is associated with improved health markers of every type. It is packed with mitochondria. What they haven't explained to enough people yet is that brown fat is not just for non-shivering thermogenesis. It is also a secretory organ. That is, it will produce hormones of its own. It will produce what are now called batokines. So these are signaling chemicals that tell the rest of the body what to do. Brown fat is an essential secretory organ. It's not just a nice to have to keep you warm in the cold. The brown fat and your thyroid are in constant chemical and nervous system communication. The thyroid and the brown fat work together to regulate your metabolism. And if you don't get any cold and you lose all your brown fat as an adult, then the thyroid is prone to becoming dysregulated, whether that's hyper, too active, or hypo, inactive. It hasn't got any brown fat to communicate with and modulate its own function. And so it goes off willy-nilly, sort of doing whatever it's going to do until the brown fat is restored. So mitochondria are essential for sex steroid synthesis, and brown fat in particular is essential for thyroid function and keeping the thyroid regulated. When it comes to fat burning, it is true that when you get into the cold plunge, you will clear glucose out of your bloodstream. The glucose is the first thing to be used for non-shivering cold thermogenesis. Then white fat cells will release some of their lipids into your bloodstream. It'll be taken up by your brown fat. And the next thing that happens is you burn that fat to generate heat. And this can go on for hours. The surprising thing is Cold plunge therapy is not really a good long-term effective weight loss strategy. It does burn a lot of fat during the period and the hours after the cold plunge. But at night, your body knows. Your body's like, hey, wait a second. We got to rebuild some of those spent fat stores. We don't know tomorrow might bring more cold. And so your basal temperature will typically drop a little bit. This is called a compensatory metabolic mechanism. Your metabolic rate will typically drop at night so that your body can rebuild subcutaneous fat. Keep in mind, the subcutaneous is right under the skin. It provides some insulation of our vital organs around our core from the cold. The subcutaneous, compared to visceral, is healthy fat. Visceral fat is around the essential organs of the body, and it's very dangerous. So even though you burn fat during the day, you can build it back up again at night. The cold, it will help with inflammation. It might even do some appetite regulation in the long term, not in the short term. And several people report to me that they've lost, 20 pounds since they started ice bathing, which is fine. You can get an immediate weight loss when you start a new program, but it is not an effective or reliable way to maintain a healthy weight. And part of that is because the subcutaneous fat is part of the way your body defends itself against the cold. What it will do is remodel that body composition. It will reduce visceral fat, including non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and replace it with subcutaneous. And so you'll have a healthier body composition, even if the large macro components of muscle and fat don't change. And there's one study out of Poland that suggests when you increase your testosterone, of course, that promotes muscle building, but there's also an impact on what's called myostatin. Myostatin regulates muscle growth, just like insulin regulates fat growth. And when you improve your insulin sensitivity, your chronic levels of insulin will go down. And there's a metabolic benefit and a body composition benefit because fat cells require insulin to grow. Myostatin has a similar relationship with the muscles. When the myostatin is too low, then the muscles can just keep growing and growing. High myostatin levels will inhibit muscle growth. There's this study out of Poland that showed cryotherapy will both reduce insulin, and so that retards the growth of fat cells, and reduce myostatin. And so that will allow muscle cells to grow. When you combine a little bit of exercise with some cold, and we should talk about how to do that, you can get dramatic improvements in body composition. But the cold alone, the sort of caloric burning benefits, they're exaggerated.
Good. I'm glad you cleared that up. I want to go back a little bit to the brown fat and where that is located for adults, which is mostly in the upper half of the body. Is that correct? Or on the clavicle and the back of the neck? And that's why we want to submerge ourselves in the cold. Is that how we do it?
So this is really interesting because brown fat exists in human infants, and there's no dispute about this, but it exists in slightly different places. In the adult human, the brown fat is located strategically to keep those internal organs warm. Now, in an infant, it will be sort of between the shoulder blades at the base of the neck, and they'll have a lot of it there. But as you grow, the brown fat redistributes throughout the body. It could even be found along the spinal cord. And it is these PET scans that identify it. Whether it's important to go all the way up to the neck to activate the brown fat or not, I've never seen any indication that going all the way up to the neck is more effective for activating the brown fat than just submerging up to the armpits. Now, I go up to my ears. I get as deep as I can. And I think that some people are making a common sense argument that if the brown fat doesn't experience contact with the cold water, then it won't be active. I think that's false because brown fat is highly innervated. That means there's a lot of nerves that go through the brown fat. Your brown fat knows when you're cold. You can activate your brown fat even going up only to the waist because it's activated by the nervous system, not by thermal receptors, in the skin next to your brown fat. I don't want to discourage people from going in all the way up to their neck. I'm like, yeah, sure, that's fine. It doesn't do any harm. You'll probably have a better experience. But I think the idea that you have to go in, at least to the clavicles, to activate your brown fat, I think that's false. I think your body knows when it's cold and when it's time to fire up some non-shivering thermogenesis.
Oh, that's good to know. Okay. I have to tell you something that I read a long time ago on this subject. It's it's The 4-Hour Body by Tim. I can't think of his last name right now.
Ferriss.
But anyway, yes. Okay. And he had this biohack that was like, if you put ice, like an ice pack on the back of your kind of neck and upper back area, that could kind of stimulate this brown fat situation. And so being the practical person that I am, I always joke, and I've told my audience before that I'm like, well, I've come home and just like defrosted meat on my back, if you will, like pulled something out of the freezer and sat on the couch. I'm like, all right, I'm going to put it right back here. And maybe this is a good biohack. Is there any truth to that, Dr. Seeger?
You're not wrong. No, it's a perfectly reasonable way to use a cold pack to try and activate your brown fat. You could do it in other ways, but I'll give you an example. When I do a cold shower, I'm on the road and I'm in a hotel and I have my Morosco, and I try and keep up with my cold practice using cold showers. I hate cold showers. They make me angry. They're different than the ice bath experience because you don't get the dive reflex. You get that revved up sympathetic fight or flight from the cold shower, but you don't get the calm that comes with the dive reflex via whole body cold water immersion. Nonetheless, you activate your brown fat. The way I do it is I'll have the cold water on the top of my chest or on the top of my back. I don't want it on the top of my head, and it doesn't do me any good on the limbs. In the cold, vasoconstriction will shut down the flow of blood to the limbs to defend your core body temperature. So you will lose less heat through your limbs and keep the heat in your core. And so I think Tim Ferriss's advice here is pretty solid. You put that cold pack at the base of your neck, sort of between your shoulder blades. Vasoconstriction will be minimal. And so you're going to extract heat from your body, activate your brown fat, and this is good for your metabolism without going through the misery of having to submerge your entire body in the cold water. This is sort of a poor man's way to get the metabolic activation. What you will not get is the same psychological response. You probably won't feel the same sense of victory, of energy and invincibility. When you emerge from the Morosco and the ice is sort of falling off your shoulders and stuff, you feel like a movie star or something. You feel like a comic book superhero. There's some part of you that is convinced you have cheated death, and now you can perform superhuman feats. I love that feeling. You might not be getting that same sort of dopamine neurochemical rush, but I agree with Tim Ferriss. You can activate your metabolism.
Okay, good. And so for us, mamas who are trying to get dinner ready, you just throw a pound of ground meat on your back, frozen ground meat, and do it that way, like I have. Okay, I want to talk about the Morosco, and I want to talk about how long we stay in, what's a good time to stay in the ice bath. But before we go there, I want to ask your opinion on testosterone for women. So we know it did a bang up job for you. Could this be helpful for women as well? All the women want to know.
There are a number of case studies in my book, and we've published them online at moroscoforge.com with regard to testosterone and women. Here's the biggest misconception. Testosterone is the dominant sex hormone in women too. Most women and their clinicians are so concerned about the estrogens that they say, well, this is part of what makes you female and all the hormones that your cycle involved. They overlook the fact that a healthy woman will have 3 to 4 times as much testosterone in her bloodstream compared to estradiol. Now, there's a reason for it. First of all, men have 10 times as much testosterone as women do. So compared to men, the testosterone in a woman's body, it seems irrelevant, but it's not. It has all of the same essential qualities in a woman as it does in a man. And so that's libido, That's motivation. That's the drive that keeps you like getting up off the couch and competing. It's the general sense of well-being and energy. Many women who have low testosterone go undiagnosed. They might wind up on a stupid SSRI without ever realizing that their mood depends upon their testosterone levels, and their testosterone levels are too low. So the same benefits that a man enjoys are available to a woman who is undergoing testosterone replacement therapy. The problem is there are no FDA approved protocols for treating women for low testosterone. Now, I'm the one who's counseling the men. Before you go on TRT, try an ice bath. Do a little exercise after your ice bath. Try these therapies that target the mitochondria. But at least men do have FDA approved pharmaceutical solutions. Women don't. A woman who has identified low T as a problem, and this can happen around menopause or perimenopause because the ovaries are not getting the same stimulation. They're just not as active anymore. That woman would do very well to start a cold plunge program. In a woman's body, only about 25% of the total testosterone is synthesized in the ovaries. The rest come from adrenal glands, skin cells, and fat cells. Chelsea, the best way to stimulate activity in your adrenals and your fat cells and your skin cells is cold water immersion therapy. There's very little data on this at the clinical scale, but there's great case studies, both from women who've had their ovaries removed, a healthy 32-year-old woman from the United Kingdom who tracked this scrupulously, big testosterone increases after adopting a program of cold water immersion therapy. But the one clinical study was this cold pressure test where they took young undergraduate women, they submerged the hand into the ice bath. So this is cold stimulation. And then they measured salivary testosterone. Saliva is not as good as bloodstream, but if it's going up, this tells us something. Women got an instant salivary testosterone boost from cold stimulation. And when the same researchers in the same study compared that to men, they didn't see the same boost. In men, testosterone is also produced in the same, the adrenals and the fat cells and the skin cells, but in quantities that are dwarfed by what's produced in the testicles. And so a man does not get the same immediate testosterone boost from the cold. In fact, he can even get a testosterone suppression from the cold. A man has to do a little exercise afterwards. And then we have really good data on both the short and the long term about how men should pre-cool exercise to get this long-term testosterone boost. This is one of the most important differences in physiology between men and women. And it's no surprise that it's found in, our sex hormone levels. Women respond to the cold immediately with a testosterone boost. Men respond to the cold immediately with a testosterone decline that can then become a boost after circulation is restored to their limbs, after they've done some rewarming exercise. Both benefit their mitochondria and their metabolism, which, as we already know, is essential to sex hormone synthesis. But in the studies that are measuring these immediate effects, the men and women respond differently. I kind of discovered this, I don't know if you'd call it the hard way, but I was having this big argument with a woman that I was dating at the time, and we'd agreed to do a photo shoot together. We didn't want to be together. We didn't want to get into that Morosco, but my daughter was the videographer, and we said that we would do this thing in Sedona, and so the video is terrible. We procrastinated until the last second. Now it's all in the shadows, and we can barely look one another in the eye because we're so angry at each other. But after about a minute, she softens. A minute and a half, she cracks a smile. Then she's making jokes. After 2.5 minutes, Chelsea, she leans in and kisses me. We start making out in the ice bath, and my daughter's like, "Cut, we have it. This is all we need." I didn't know what was going on inside her body as a result of the cold. I went with it, thank goodness. But it wasn't just testosterone. Remember, testosterone is the lust hormone. I was not experiencing that big boost in testosterone, but she was getting it in the ice bath. 2.5 minutes later, I guess I started looking good to her again. And it was more. And it was also vasopressin, oxytocin, and dopamine are all produced in the woman's body in the ice bath. And these are the relationship hormones. These create bonding between the individuals. So another good reason is to, with your spouse or your partner, get in together, hold hands, breathe together, make eye contact. This might be better than marriage counseling.
That's incredible. Okay, this might be the thing that makes me do the ice bath once and for all. How long do we have to stay in there? What's a good time? And how often do we do it throughout the week?
Everything that you read on Google about the optimal time and temperature for an ice bath is bogus, because Google does not know what your prior state of cold training is. Go cold enough to gasp and long enough to shiver. What you really need is a rule of thumb. There is no one time and temperature that is right for everyone. If you feel the gasp reflex when you get into the water, that's cold enough for you. And if you're just starting out, stay long enough so that you feel the urge to shiver. And it doesn't have to be a strong urge, but you're like, I'm feeling like I'm going to shiver, is fine. There's no more benefits for you. You have activated all of those mechanisms that are going to recruit new brown fat. You do this every day for about 2 weeks, you will have brown fat in your body. And then you won't need to shiver. The non-shivering thermogenesis will be keeping you warm. So after a period of acclimation, always go cold enough to gasp. You'll have to drop the temperature, for example, of your Morosco down low enough so that you really don't want to do it, so that it frightens you to get in. Always keep the temperature cold enough to gasp. But 3-4 minutes is plenty. When you've been practicing for a while, you don't need to stay in very long, because you will activate your brown fat. You will get the metabolic and the psychological benefits. When Jack Kruse and some other people were experimenting with ice baths, there was no such thing as a Morosco. You had to get a Rubbermaid garbage can or a stock tank or something. And then you had to go down to the store and get 200 pounds of ice. And it was this whole big rigmarole. When that was going on, people felt, well, it took me an hour to get, ready for this thing. I'm not just going to spend 3 minutes and jump out. I want to get my money's worth, And so the protocols were typically 50, 55 degrees, stay in there for 30, 35 minutes, because the technology that they had available, that's what made sense. Now that we have Morosco, it's 34 degrees on my balcony right now, and I can go 2-3 times a day if I want without having to buy ice. You can go very cold and very short and get a lot of benefit.
Okay, good to know. That does make sense. That I could see myself doing the same thing. Like, this took me so long to pull together, get nice and pour it in here. I'm going to get my money's worth. Okay, so tell us a little bit more about the Morosco.
There are some things about Morosco that make it what we call the next best thing to nature. There are some unique attributes that make Morosco more expensive and worth it. When you get into the, Pacific Ocean, when you get into the lake, when you get into a natural body of water like a mountain stream, it is always grounded. You're not just getting the cold water. You're also getting electrons from the earth. You're correcting the imbalance in your own static charge, reducing the viscosity of your blood, improving your blood circulation. So a natural body of water is always going to be grounded. So is Morosco. But your plastic, acrylic, fiberglass, cheap chub from China is not grounded. So you've created a more artificial experience. You've saved a lot of money, but you're not getting the benefit of the grounding. When you get into the ocean, you're also getting the minerals from the water. You will absorb them through your skin. But when you get into your own bathtub in which you've, poured ice cubes and things like that, all you're getting is chlorine and fluoride and whatever else they're putting in your water treatment system. You're not getting the minerals like the Epsom salt or the zinc sulfate that we recommend adding. And so the Second thing is Morosco is warranted for use of Epsom salt. You can make your ice bath a mineral bath, and there are a lot of good reasons to do that. The third thing is we make ice. And this makes us probably the most hated ice bath brand in the world. I mean, even our biggest advocates hate that aspect of their experience. Joe Rogan just had Matthew McConaughey on the show, and they both ice bath. And Joe was saying, let me tell you something. Every morning, I almost don't do my ice bath because it is so dang hard to be staring at those floating ice chunks in the water and still make yourself go through the experience. You're not going to regret it. You're going to feel proud and you're going to start your morning with a win, but nobody enjoys it. You're supposed to hate it. And Andrew Huberman did a really good podcast with David Goggins that explained why. There's a portion of your brain called the anterior mid-cingulate cortex. When you do the things that you do not enjoy, that you just hate, but you bring yourself to do them anyway, the anterior mid-cingulate cortex grows. And so in a lot of athletes who are accustomed to working out really hard, it's larger. Huberman says, if you enjoyed the ice bath, you're not growing your anterior mid-cingulate cortex at all. It has to be something that makes you uncomfortable, that you hate doing to grow that portion of your brain. And why is it worth it? Because that is the seat of willpower, including, he says, the seat of the will to live. And so every morning you can curse my name. You can say, damn that Morosco. I wish I'd never had Professor Seeger on my podcast. And it is okay. I will receive that message like a blessing because I know you're about to do something that is really difficult that will make you proud of yourself later on. Your life will seem that much more worth living when you're done with the ice bath that you hated to do.
Yeah, I have a lot of opportunity for growth in that area for sure. Okay, there's a couple of things I do not want to miss talking to you about before we wrap up, and that is the benefit of cold related to vitamin D. So let's start there. I think this is really, really cool. Can you share more about that?
This is brand new research, and it has taken me about a year to get my head around it and figure out how much sense it makes. It's one of those things where after it's explained to you, you go, oh, that must be obvious. But before it's explained, it sounds preposterous. Here's the way it goes. You probably understand, like everybody else, that the human being is photosynthetic. When we're in the summer sunshine, UVB light will impinge upon our skin and it will convert cholesterol into pre-vitamin D that is then later metabolized into all the complex forms of vitamin D. So our skin is essential in this regard to synthesize vitamin D from cholesterol in the sunshine. Everybody gets that. Well, light also exists inside your body, not just on the surface of your body, but inside. When it is generated by your mitochondria, it's called biophotons. The mitochondria are constantly moving electrons around. It's what they do. It's called respiration. Oxygen will come in. They will attach it to carbon or to hydrogen to make carbon dioxide and water as the waste products. And to do that requires that the mitochondria move these electrons around. When electrons move, they emit light. They can't help it. Every atom has a different characteristic light profile. This is how fireworks are so colorful, where magnesium is white and cobalt is blue. And so all of the different elements that they pack the rocket with will explode into different colors, because when those metals burn in the atmosphere, we're moving electrons around, combining them with oxygen, and they emit light. Your mitochondria make light. Biophotons have been observed in every single living system ever studied, including plants. Some of the light that the mitochondria make is in the UVB range. Now, for most people, it makes total sense that mitochondria make light. How could they possibly make heat if not light? Heat is light. It's several thousands of nanometers in wavelength, but we must admit that during non-shivering thermogenesis, the mitochondria are making light. The big revelation is that some of that light is in the UVB range, and it's happening right inside your brown fat cell. When that UVB is released, some of it will intersect cholesterol, which exists right inside the brown fat cell next to the mitochondria. And it will convert that cholesterol to pre-vitamin D. The pre-vitamin D that is synthesized in your skin must be further converted and travel through your bloodstream until it finds a place to be stored inside a fat cell. Because all the different forms of vitamin D are lipophilic. They don't dissolve in water, they dissolve in fat. So they have to be stored in your fat. But when your mitochondria in your brown fat cell are synthesizing the vitamin D right inside the brown fat cell, there's no reason for it to be released into the bloodstream. It can stay right there until it's needed. And so this would explain why biophotons, or exposure to the cold that produces biophotons, could also produce vitamin D without observing an increase in blood serum levels of the forms of vitamin D that are typically tested for. A lot of people on Twitter hated that. They're like, that sounds like a bunch of malarkey. There's no freaking way. People in northern latitudes, the only reason they don't die of rickets is because they eat baby seal blubber, something like this. You can get vitamin D from fish and animal sources in your diet, although I don't recommend supplements unless you're severely deficient. Then a study came out of Poland. It was women with multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is associated, like all autoimmune disorders, MS is associated with disorders of vitamin D metabolism. And so there are good reasons why scientists want to study MS patients and monitor their vitamin D status. So they took these women with MS and subjected them to cryotherapy. This is frigid air. And then they measured their vitamin D. Vitamin D went up. And they didn't change any diet. They didn't feed them cod liver oil or anything like that. They didn't put them, out in the sun. They conducted this study, if I remember correctly, during the winter. It's the first time that we've measured an increase in blood serum levels of vitamin D as a result of cold exposure in exactly the way that this mechanism, and the Polish study didn't mention biophotons at all, but in exactly the way that this mechanism would predict. Cold stimulates production of vitamin D inside the body. And now all of a sudden you're like, doesn't that make sense? What the hell were people, living in Great Britain or Norway or Finland or whatever? How could our ancestors have ever survived with these long winters without the sun? It's only after we shut ourselves inside in our climate controlled environments and start eating our processed food and avoid the cold that the real maladies of modernity begin to show up. When we align our thermal environment with the seasons that are consistent with our light environment, our body knows what to do. When we disconnect these, now our light environment and our thermal environment are discordant, and that's when the body becomes sick. You can make vitamin D inside your own body by exposing yourself to the cold. There are now these videos going around Instagram, and they're cute as hell. You see these little babies, and they're all sort of swaddled up, and they're left outside in the stroller in the snow or something like that. And from the American point of view, it looks like we should be reporting people to Child Protective Services. This looks like abuse. But the babies, they seem happy, and they're sleeping, and they're quiet. They are making vitamin D during the wintertime in Russia or Finland or Denmark or wherever they are. And this ancient practice of putting the child out in the cold is rooted in successful health and development of the immune system of the child. They didn't know anything about biophotons. When these Vikings started putting their infants in the cold, only now are we discovering the mechanisms by which it was keeping them healthy.
It makes so much sense to me because one thing I'm always looking at the way, through a God designed body. I mean, and I always say, God's just not like, oh, you only get vitamin D if you live near the equator. Everybody else in the world's hosed. Sorry. I mean, that's just not the way it works. You know what I mean? Whether it's a food provision or whatever it is, it's just, there's provision out there. There is a mechanism for it. So it makes complete sense to me. And that's why it makes me so excited. But I've been dying to ask you to bring all that connection together. So thank you. The very last thing I want to talk about is using the cold for sports performance and recovery. I, for instance, have I've got some teenagers very much into athletics, where they're doing these cold baths and things like that. And I've heard you kind of speak some nuance into this. So I'd love for you to share about that.
How old are your kids? You say teenagers. They must be in high school?
Yeah. So I have a 16-year-old and a 14-year-old. My 16-year-old plays tennis and football and basketball, everything.
Yeah,
so,
good for them. One of the things that happens to high school football players, every August, it's going to be football season again. The coach will call the returning players and they'll say, hey, we're going to start football camp. We're going to start it 2 weeks before, classes start or something like this. And he's going to get these young boys back into shape. The same thing happens in women's sports. Before basketball season, I remember I was dating this one woman who was on the team and they did 2-a-days before the season actually started to get them into shape. Well, the young people who are called upon to do these 2-a-day practices have the problem of delayed onset muscle soreness. In between the practices, you can use the ice bath, and the coaches know this, to reduce inflammation in the athlete, to reduce delayed onset muscle soreness, and get them ready for the next practice. And so the high school coaches or college coaches that are using ice baths with their young athletes to do these extreme, especially preseason workouts, makes a lot of sense. An ice bath after a workout will prepare the athlete for competition again faster. Chelsea, I'm going to be 60 years old. I'm not trying out for the freshman football team. I'm not trying to make the basketball squad. I don't care. I'm looking for my psychological and metabolic well-being. I don't work out much, but I never do the ice bath after the exercise. I always do ice bath before the exercise. This is called pre-cooling. The heat is one of the things that will impair exercise performance. Mitochondria, when they're working, are subject to what's called reactive oxygen species damage. A little bit of ROS is a good thing. It stimulates mitobiogenesis. But when it goes too far, it will damage the mitochondrial DNA. And then the mitochondria are going to need a rest period to recover and come back stronger. No, that's fine. The phenomena of fatigue protects the mitochondria from that damage. So before you do something irreversibly harmful to your mitochondria, your muscles become fatigued, you run out of gas, and your body says, hey, let's give the mitochondria a break. Cooling the mitochondria either during the exercise or right before the exercise will reduce the amount of ROS production and allow peak performance. So this is the amount of power that the mitochondria can produce go up and extend longer without fatigue. So extracting heat from the body, either before or between sets, which is called per-cooling, is a way of getting better performance out of the mitochondria that are fueling the muscle growth and development. The downside of doing the ice bath after your workout is that it will blunt some of that testosterone response. If what you're going for is you want bigger muscles, well, you want the inflammation, you want the testosterone, you want your body to experience that hormetic stress, and you'd be way better off doing the ice bath before. But if you're in that 2-a-day environment, or if you're competing in the US Open and you have another set, another match that you have to play the next day, get yourself in the ice bath so you can get back to performance level fast. It's not that ice baths are good or bad after exercise. It all depends on what are you trying to do. Are you training your metabolism, your hormone levels, or are you trying to return to competition as quickly as you can?
Yes. Thank you for that distinction. I think that's really important for people to hear. All right. Awesome. Gosh, we covered so much. Everything I wanted to. I'm so happy. Before I let you go, I've got to ask you the anchor questions I ask all my guests. And the first is, what is your anchor meal? It's like a go-to healthy meal that you eat all the time.
I've been on a beef bacon kick. And bacon might not sound like a healthy meal. It is healthy. When you eat a healthy animal, the fats inside the animal are healthy. So there's a butcher here in Phoenix. It's not far from my house. It's called Underbelly. I love this butcher because everything there is local and it's grass fed. And they introduced me to something called beef bacon. So this is a fatty cut of the cow that is cured like bacon. And I had some this morning. I think it's delicious. It's healthy for me because the fat in the animal is healthy. I don't know if I have a go-to meal. I have a weakness for pumpkin pie, which probably isn't the worst thing, to eat. When I make it, I sweeten it with maple syrup instead of, evaporated milk or sweetened condensed milk or something like that. So that's one of my favorites that is not carnivore. But I think ground beef and eggs just goes such a long way. I'm not all that sophisticated a chef when I'm by myself. If I'm cooking for other people, I will cook lamb or I will cook duck. I will cook something that they know is good, but they're not used to having themselves. And then I'll feel a little special. But when I'm cooking for myself, it's going to be beef bacon and free range eggs and ground beef. Seafood is one of my favorites. And I live in Phoenix, Arizona. So it's not like I can drive down to the pier and get it right off the boat.
Right. Ground beef and eggs. I live off that quite a bit myself. So I'm with you. Okay. How about an anchor verse or Bible verse that you like?
My best education came from Vacation Bible School. So we went to Sunday school. My parents raised us Episcopalian. And I found out later that Episcopalian and Catholics have all the same hymns, all the same rituals, like sit, kneel, stand, sit, kneel. It's like an aerobic workout, every Sunday.
I'm Episcopalian.
There you go. But there's a lot less guilt in the Episcopalian. There's no confession, for example. Yeah. And in a way, I guess the Episcopalians can kind of get away with more. But Vacation Bible School was not an Episcopalian tradition. It was the way that my mother needed to get the kids out of the house during the summer. So my Bible education came to me through comic books. Like, if this makes sense, these were cartoon child versions of Bible stories that would be interesting to me and other children my age. And they always had a moral lesson. Now, some of them were like adventure stories. My favorite is Noah. I became a civil engineer. And so I work in disaster resilience, for goodness sakes. And, Noah building the ark, and he's going to save the animals from the flood. The way it was introduced to me as a child was in this comic book adventure series. I only realized later that it's real. I only realized later that the Black Sea didn't used to be full of water. It was when the Mediterranean broke through the Bosporus and Dardanelles in Turkey that it flooded the Black Sea, that there were people living below sea level in little villages all throughout the Black Sea. And that's where Noah lived. And he must have had advanced warning about the Mediterranean breaking through the Bosporus and Dardanelles. And he's probably the only one who took it seriously. And he built this ark and he saved what a great story. It's a Bible story, but it's not a story with the same sort of moral impact on me. The one that I remember is there was the Lord or the king who had 3 servants, and he's going away. And he gave each servant, a certain number of talents or something like that, whatever the shekels, I don't know what they were, gold pieces, right?
They were talents. Talents.
Okay. One servant got 1, and another got 3, and another got 7. And I'm going to butcher the story, but trying to remember, I'm talking to you like I'm 7 years old right now. The one who got 7, he started like a used camel dealership, and he's like making all kinds of money dealing in camels. And so when the Lord comes back, he'd taken these 7 talents and he multiplied them. Now he has dozens of talents, and the Lord praised him. And the one who only got 3, he opened up like a rug store or something. And now he's selling these rugs and he's making little money. And he came back with 10. And the one who only had the 1 talent, he buried it in a well where, it could never have been stolen. And he returned the 1 talent back to his master. And he was looking to be praised for being so conservative. And the master scolded him for failing to take a chance on what the master had given him, right? That it would have been better if he tried and failed than to just sit on his little treasure. That one stuck with me. Probably not for my own good, Chelsea. Probably, I've been out there. What kind of crazy idiot starts an ice bath company, for goodness sakes? I've been out there living like that guy who was blessed with, the larger number of talents, but doing things that might squander them all because I've been so foolhardy in the risks that I've taken, but I have lived my life as if it is better to have tried and failed miserably than to have never tried at all.
I love that. And I would say you are not failing. You're multiplying the blessings by your education and what you're doing here. And just like you did today, I think it's amazing. And thank God you're doing what you're doing. So no, I think you're using your talents well, if you will. Awesome. Okay. Well, how can people connect with you, find you? Because it's not your typical, since you are an active professor, but where can people find more about your information, your books, and all that good stuff?
Oh, if you're a student at Arizona State University in the civil engineering program, you can take my class. But if that's not you, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram, Seager TP, SeagerTP, moroscoforge.com. Everything that I've ever written about cold plunge therapy is available for free at moroscoforge.com. But if you are like me and you want to write in the margins of the book and you need a hard copy, you can get Uncommon Cold from moroscoforge.com. You can get Uncommon Testosterone from Amazon in hardcover.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it so much. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a healthy and blessed week, and I will talk to you soon.